Hi students, we're back with the video presentation for the class on spirituality, religion, and secularism. I'm here with Meira,
Hi, I'm Maira. I'm Professor Harris's daughter.
and we're going to be talking about the two articles that were assigned for this week's reading. The Schneider's article about spirituality and religion, and the Ronda article about transcendentalism and the secular turn. So first, the Schneider's article. Schneider's talks about spirituality and religion. She talks about her thesis that spirituality doesn't necessarily conflict with religion and it's not parallel to it, that it has to work together with religion, that a spirituality that doesn't work um, that doesn't spirituality that's not connected to a religious tradition is going to be rootless and not really all that meaningful. And by the same token, a religion that doesn't have spirituality is going to be dead and not all that meaningful. So what I'd like to ask you is about how do you think about your own spirituality, just for the benefit of the group. Meira is very much connected with an organization called JFREJ, Jews for Religious and Economic Justice, and she finds a lot of meaning and purpose in her work with that.
It's racial and economic justice, but it's okay.
Oh, so how does
Anyway,
that connect with your spirituality and your Jewish identity?
hmm. Well, I think that one thing that the group talks a lot about is the need to ground our work with spiritual and ritual practices from the Jewish religion. And based on my upbringing, I think that that is really important because um, when you have religion, it needs to be rooted to spirituality. And when you have spirituality, or like you're trying to make meaning of the present moment, it is very important to root it back into your tradition. And that can bring a lot of importance to the work that you're doing. So it tends to ground the work that you're doing in your history, in tradition, in a larger community. And when you make space for spirituality within your rituals and you make space within your rituals for spirituality, you can have more spiritual moments.
Oh, good. One of the things that struck me both in this conversation and really in the article itself was just how difficult it is to define spirituality. I thought she did a pretty good job of explaining what she meant by religion, which is itself can be very challenging. But when it came to spirituality, she talked about self transcendence and holistic moves and experiences. Um, and she seemed to me to be less successful in really communicating what she meant by spirituality.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe it's just a term that defies um, definition. Maybe it's just a word that people use when they think about religion and they think about all of the things about it that they don't like. They say that it lacks spirituality.
Hmm.
Um, but I thought she could have done maybe a better job of cleaning up and maybe um, shrinking her definition of spirituality because it had about, I don't know, 6 or 7 different elements to it. And by the end of that, I kind of knew what she meant, but I didn't think she did a great job of really explaining it very clearly.
Hmm.
But you and I, in the conversations that we've had, we use spirituality as a term when we're looking at a group like the Transcendentalists. And, the subtitle of the class is American Transcendentalists, Spirituality Without Religion. So that
Hmm.
just implies that, when the folks in the Fordham Theology Department were putting the course together, they thought that this was a word that they could put into the title, and people would at least ascribe some meaning to it, even if it wasn't a term that could be so clearly defined. But I think that one of the things as we go through the semester and we read, whether it's Emerson or Thoreau or the other writers that we encounter, um, if we ask, are they spiritual, just to grapple and try to clarify what that concept means, I think it's going to be challenging and interesting.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
yeah, let's move for a second to the Rhonda article.
Mm-hmm.
There, basically, the question that he's dealing with is, was the Transcendentalist movement a religious movement or a secular movement? Um, and one of the things that he's grappling with from the historical perspective is the fact that, as we talked about last week, you can see Transcendentalism as kind of the last in a series of American religious traditions. There was Calvinism, then came Unitarianism, then came Transcendentalism, and then, scholars of later American religious history could look at Transcendentalism within that continuum and try to see where it stands. And I think what he's trying to say is that transcendentalism should be viewed not necessarily as part of that religious continuum, but it's sort of as a broadening of American thought, as a way to ask not how should we think theologically, but rather is a theological perspective the only or the best way to make sense out of the universe. And
Hmm.
he looks at the different thinkers within the transcendentalist movement to try to identify the different strands within it. He talks about dense versus fluid transcendentalism. Again, I thought that wasn't quite sure where he was. Maybe those words were just more confusing. But I think it will be interesting to question as we go through each one specifically, not just is the transcendentalist movement religious or secular, but more each individual thinker along that line. There may be a different answer. Um, we may think differently about Emerson, for example, who spent so much of his career thinking about theological inquiry. What is God? Um, how does that fit into the Christian tradition that he was um, addressing, versus some of the later thinkers who may be broader, like Rhonda does mention Thoreau as an example of somebody who was more fluid rather than dense. So I think that'll be an interesting perspective. So basically, just to tie these two articles together, the first one asks, what is spirituality? Spirituality, what is religion? How do the two of them relate to one another?
Hmm.
And that'll enable us to see, were the transcendentalists really spiritual but not religious? Is that something? Is that terminology that can be meaningfully applied to them? Um, so that article really focuses on the spirituality side of the subtitle. And then the second article really focuses on the question of um, what what does it mean to be secular?
Hmm.
Religion versus secular. Is
Hmm.
that is that a meaningful distinction? And that's also a distinction that I think we should keep in mind as we go through the rest of the semester.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah, that
great.
sounds great.
Sounds interesting. Okay, Meira, thanks for your help. We'll
My
get back to
pleasure.
you.